At exactly 3:47 a.m. in Doha, the night sky lit up with flames. Israeli F-35 jets pierced Qatari airspace and unleashed precision strikes on a sovereign capital. No warning, no provocation, just fire falling from the sky. Across television screens, families ran barefoot through the smoke, clutching children and belongings. And thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré picked up the phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. His words were simple, sharp, unforgettable. Your aircraft crossed a line. Africa will not stay silent. That single call shattered the illusion that Africa would remain a passive observer in global affairs. For decades, powerful nations acted as though African sovereignty was negotiable, as though this continent could be bought with contracts or silenced with threats. But on that morning, Burkina Faso drew a line that resonated far beyond Qatar. Within hours, the Israeli ambassador scrambled for emergency meetings. Within a day, African leaders convened urgent sessions. And within 3 days, Israel was facing the one thing it had never anticipated: consequences delivered by Africa's united voice. This is not just about Israel or Qatar. This is about the moment Africa declared that sovereignty matters everywhere and that violations will be met with action, not silence. It is about a new chapter where African capitals no longer bow to intimidation, but stand shoulder to shoulder with partners who once stood by us. My brothers and sisters, the question is not whether Israel miscalculated. The question is whether Africa's awakening has finally begun. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's stand shows the world that Africa is ready to defend its dignity, its sovereignty, and its partners? Or do you think the West will find new ways to dismiss this rising voice? Please share if you feel proud that Africa stood tall for Qatar, and subscribe if you believe that the truth must rise above the headlines. The night it all began, Doha was quiet. Families were asleep, traffic lights blinked on empty roads, and the hum of air conditioners filled apartment blocks. Then at 3:47 a.m., the silence was ripped apart. Israeli F-35 fighter jets sliced into Qatari airspace and released precision bombs on the capital. No warning, no declaration, no justification that international law could accept. The explosions turned stillness into chaos. Glass shattered, alarms screamed, and entire neighborhoods scrambled in fear. Israel's government would later say it was a counterterrorism operation, that the strike was preemptive defense. But these words were nothing more than diplomatic camouflage. For years, powerful nations have cloaked naked aggression in the language of security, yet this was no shadow conflict in occupied land. This was Qatar, a sovereign nation recognized by the United Nations with embassies, treaties, and protections under international law. Doha was not Gaza. Doha was not a disputed territory. It was a free capital attacked without cause. From Ouagadougou, thousands of miles away, Ibrahim Traoré was watching the news feeds. The camera panned across the Doha skyline, lit by flames, and in those fires Traoré saw his own capital. He saw families running in terror, just as African families had run from wars they never started. He saw children crying under collapsing buildings, just as African children had cried in forgotten conflicts. In that moment, silence became impossible. At 4:00 a.m., he summoned his cabinet. His message was clear: prepare our strongest condemnation. Africa speaks today. By sunrise, the presidential palace in Burkina Faso had issued a historic statement. Burkina Faso condemns Israel's unprovoked action against Qatar. But Traoré did not stop at words. Words without action are powerless, he told his ministers. Immediately, he ordered all military training programs with Israel suspended, defense contracts canceled, intelligence cooperation terminated. The news hit Tel Aviv like a thunderclap. Within 2 hours, the Israeli ambassador was on the phone begging for clarification. Mr. President, this is a misunderstanding. Traoré's reply was cold and sharp. The only misunderstanding is Netanyahu believing Africa will not defend sovereignty. Israel had miscalculated. For decades, it had assumed Africa's role was peripheral, a continent to offer votes at the UN in exchange for aid or training contracts. But in a matter of hours, that assumption collapsed. African nations holding the world's strategic minerals, oil reserves, and diplomatic weight suddenly looked like the decisive voice. Inside Tel Aviv, panic spread. Leaked reports later revealed Netanyahu personally called 3 African presidents that same day. Ghana's leader hung up. Nigeria's president refused the call outright. Kenya's president listened for half a minute, then disconnected. Within 24 hours, Israeli defense contractors began calculating massive losses as African governments prepared to suspend multi-billion-dollar deals. Lobbyists in Washington rushed to emergency meetings, asking, how did we fail to anticipate Africa's reaction? The truth was simple. No one in Tel Aviv believed African sovereignty mattered, but now it did. The images of Doha's burning skyline had become a mirror for African leaders. If Israel could strike Qatar today, what would stop another power from striking Ouagadougou, Abuja, or Accra tomorrow? By the end of the first day, it was no longer just Burkina Faso standing alone. One condemnation had triggered what would soon become a continental awakening. The hours after Burkina Faso's bold stand felt like a chain reaction no one could stop. What began with a single phone call from Ibrahim Traoré to Netanyahu quickly spread across the continent like wildfire. By the end of the first day, 15 African presidents had issued public condemnations of Israel's strike on Qatar. Their words echoed Traoré's sovereignty was not negotiable. Within 48 hours, the African Union announced an emergency session in Addis Ababa. The tone of the meeting was unlike anything seen before. African leaders did not debate whether Israel was justified. They debated how to punish it. One delegate summed it up simply, if Qatar can be bombed today without consequence tomorrow, it may be us. Africa cannot remain silent. By 72 hours, the response had crystallized into action. South Africa suspended diplomatic relations with Israel. Algeria closed its airspace to all Israeli aircraft. Morocco, often considered a quiet partner of Israel, canceled major agricultural agreements. Nigeria, one of Africa's largest economies, terminated its defense contracts outright. Ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv across multiple capitals. For the first time in modern history, Israel was staring at coordinated African retaliation. Inside Israel, the panic was palpable. Netanyahu personally tried to reach out to leaders he thought he could sway, but his calls were rejected. Leaked recordings later captured his frustration as he asked advisors, how did we not anticipate African reaction? The silence in the room told the truth. They had never believed African sovereignty carried weight. In desperation, Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant boarded a plane and flew to 3 African capitals. But his reception was humiliating. Presidents refused to meet him. Foreign ministers declined official appointments. In some airports, diplomatic privileges normally extended to foreign dignitaries were stripped away. African media captured the moment a high-ranking Israeli official left waiting in lounges like any other passenger. Meanwhile, in Washington, alarm bells were ringing. State Department officials bombarded African leaders with calls urging restraint. CIA liaisons paid unannounced visits to presidential palaces. One U.S. ambassador told Traoré directly, "Your reaction is destabilizing regional security." His answer cut through the hypocrisy. Israel targeting Qatar destabilized security. We are simply responding with consequences. The harder Washington pressed, the more united Africa became. It was as though outside pressure confirmed what Traoré had said all along, that Africa must stand together when sovereignty is violated. The effects rippled far beyond Africa. In the Middle East, Arab nations who had hesitated to act now found courage in Africa's defiance. Qatar praised Burkina Faso directly, thanking Traoré for his leadership. The Arab League convened its own emergency meeting, openly citing Africa's example as a model of solidarity. In Asia and Latin America, leaders who normally issued only cautious statements now spoke out boldly. They no longer feared isolation because Africa had set the tone. Turkey and Iran applauded Africa's stance, calling it a lesson in defending sovereignty for the entire world. For Israel, what was supposed to be a demonstration of strength had become a showcase of weakness. Its assumption of impunity had collapsed. Defense companies counted losses in the billions as contracts disappeared overnight. Diplomats complained of closed doors across 3 continents. Television analysts in Tel Aviv admitted the unthinkable. For the first time, Israel is facing real consequences for its actions in Africa and beyond. The climax was undeniable. In just 3 days, Africa had shifted the balance of global diplomacy. A continent once treated as an afterthought had stood shoulder to shoulder with Qatar and forced a regional superpower to reckon with the cost of its actions. This was no longer just about Israel or Qatar. This was about a continental awakening, one that told the world when Africa speaks together, even the most powerful must listen. The dust of Doha's bombing had barely settled, yet the political and civil consequences consequences were already reshaping entire regions. For Israel, the cost was immediate and undeniable. Contracts once worth billions of dollars evaporated overnight. African governments tore up defense agreements, canceled agricultural projects, and halted intelligence cooperation. Strategic minerals, uranium, gold, and oil that Israel had quietly depended on were suddenly out of reach. The ripple effects extended to the United Nations, where 54 African votes could no longer be counted on to shield Israel from condemnation. In Tel Aviv, analysts admitted on live television. For the first time, Israel faces a coordinated African backlash, but the consequences were not limited to Israel's isolation. Across Africa, the episode ignited a new sense of pride and urgency. Ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso poured into the streets waving both national and Qatari flags. For many, it was not just solidarity, it was personal. Watching Qatari families flee from collapsing buildings mirrored their own painful memories of displacement during conflicts in the Sahel. In Ouagadougou, women's groups organized vigils chanting, "Qatar today, Africa tomorrow, never again," in silence. In Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, and Morocco, civic organizations echoed the call. University students staged debates on sovereignty. Religious leaders preached sermons reminding congregations that protecting partners like Qatar was a moral obligation. Civil society found in Traoré's response a symbol that African dignity was no longer negotiable. The political impact inside Africa was equally profound. Leaders who once hesitated to break with Western-backed policies found themselves under popular pressure to follow Burkina Faso's example. Opposition parties in several countries seized the moment, demanding their governments take stronger stands against foreign interference. Parliaments debated emergency motions to cut ties with Israel. The narrative was no longer about a single airstrike, it was about Africa's collective right to be treated as equal players in global politics. Burkina Faso itself experienced a transformation. Traoré's decisive action elevated him from a national figure to a continental leader. The same day that Western diplomats accused him of destabilizing the region, African newspapers hailed him as the defender of sovereignty. Citizens in Ouagadougou began referring to his late-night phone call to Netanyahu as the call that changed Africa. Meanwhile, Israel's isolation only deepened. Defense Minister Gallant's failed African tour became a political embarrassment. Media across the continent published images of him waiting unattended in airports, a symbol of declining influence. Internationally, Israel's reputation as an untouchable power began to crack. Without African resources and votes, its position in global institutions grew fragile. Perhaps the most significant consequence was psychological. For decades, Africans had been told their countries were too weak, too divided to resist great powers. The reaction to Israel's strike proved otherwise. In just 3 days, a coordinated African stand had cost one of the world's most militarized states both money and prestige. The myth of African irrelevance was shattered. This turning point also planted seeds of long-term change. Governments across the continent began exploring new alliances independent of Western oversight. Discussions about Pan-African defense frameworks accelerated. Diplomats whispered that if Africa could force Israel to reconsider its calculations, it could also demand fairer trade investment and respect from other global powers. The airstrike on Qatar had been intended to demonstrate Israeli strength. Instead, it revealed African strength. The civil and political aftermath proved that when Africa defends sovereignty, the cost of aggression is no longer borne by victims alone, it is shared by those who violate the rules. While Africa's united response shocked Tel Aviv, it sent an even deeper tremor through Washington. For decades, U.S. policymakers had treated Africa as a reliable diplomatic partner, willing to align with Western positions in exchange for aid or security assistance. Suddenly, that assumption was gone. 54 nations had demonstrated that they could not only resist pressure, but also impose real costs on one of America's closest allies. Inside, the State Department cables described the situation as unprecedented. Analysts worried that if African nations could coordinate against Israel, they might soon do the same against U.S. policies in the region. Minerals like cobalt, lithium, and uranium, critical for America's energy future, were now bargaining chips in African hands. The CA scrambled to reassure Washington that the situation could still be contained, but behind closed doors, officials admitted they had underestimated the scale of Africa's awakening. American diplomats fanned out across African capitals, urging restraint. They warned that such defiance might jeopardize aid packages or military support. Yet the harder Washington pressed, the stronger the African resolve became. Leaders quietly reminded U.S. envoys that aid was no longer the lifeline. It once was. New partners in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America were already offering alternatives. One African minister reportedly told a U.S. ambassador, "You gave us lectures. Qatar gave us hospitals." Which of those do you think our people remember? Meanwhile, in the broader world, Africa's bold stand rippled outward. In the Middle East, Arab nations rallied around Qatar, emboldened by Africa's show of solidarity. The Arab League issued one of its strongest statements in years, citing Africa's leadership as the reason for its decisiveness. In Asia, countries like Turkey and Iran praised the African Union for defending sovereignty when others hesitated. Even in Latin America, leaders invoked Africa's example, reminding their citizens that smaller nations could resist larger powers when united. For Israel, the damage extended far beyond Africa. Its diplomats encountered closed doors not only in African capitals, but in regions where African influence was respected. Multilateral organizations began to question whether continued support for Israel was worth alienating such a massive bloc of nations. Companies calculating long-term investments realized that aligning with Tel Aviv now carried new political risks. In Europe, reactions were divided. Some governments quietly sympathized with Israel, but they could not ignore the fact that Africa had shifted the global narrative. European media outlets, often critical of African politics, suddenly described the continent as a moral voice in international affairs. For the first time, Africa was setting the tone for global diplomacy rather than merely reacting to it. The strategic consequence was clear: Africa had proven itself indispensable. Whether in UN votes, natural resource supply chains, or diplomatic legitimacy, no major power could now afford to treat the continent as a secondary player. Washington understood this with a sense of dread. Beijing and Moscow understood it with satisfaction. But for Africans themselves, it was a moment of clarity, the recognition that their collective voice could reshape the balance of world power. The strike on Qatar was meant to intimidate. Instead, it awakened a new force in global politics, an Africa that the United States, Israel, and Europe could no longer ignore. The roar of jet engines over Doha may have lasted only minutes, but the echo of that night will linger for decades. Israel's strike on Qatar was supposed to be a demonstration of military dominance. Instead, it became the spark that revealed Africa's hidden strength. What the world witnessed was not simply a condemnation. It was a collective awakening, a continent that for too long had been treated as a spectator, suddenly stepping into the role of decisive actor. Burkina Faso's voice, carried by President Ibrahim Traoré, cut through the silence of international hesitation. Where Washington offered concerns and Europe whispered diplomatic dialogue, Africa delivered something far more powerful: consequences. That shift matters. It tells every nation from the halls of NATO to the palaces of the Middle East that sovereignty is no longer negotiable. Violations will be met not with statements, but with action. Yet the story does not end here. The warning extends beyond Israel. It is a message to every power, whether the United States in Iraq, Russia in Ukraine, or future aggressors eyeing Africa's own soil, that the global South is no longer a field for domination. Africa has proven that unity transforms vulnerability into leverage. And once that door is opened, it cannot easily be closed. But with this awakening comes responsibility. Can Africa sustain this momentum? Will leaders hold the line when economic threats, covert operations, and diplomatic pressure escalate? And can ordinary Africans translate this moment of continental pride into lasting political will? These questions will decide whether this was a passing storm or the dawn of a new era. For the elders watching this channel, Americans, Africans, and friends of justice around the world, this is not just about foreign policy. It is about the kind of world our grandchildren will inherit. A world where might still makes right, or a world where sovereignty is defended no matter the size of the nation under attack. So I ask you, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance shows that Africa is finally ready to lead the defense of global sovereignty? Or will the old powers find a way to bend this awakening back into silence? Please share this video if you feel that you are among the first to witness Africa's rise in real time. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, however inconvenient, is always more important than the headlines. Because today Africa's voice said enough, and tomorrow that same voice may be the one defending sovereignty in places yet unseen.